found it very difficult to to actually make sense of that. So what I ended up doing myself, the difficulty that I had in making sense of it was actually to come up with a framework, and that is called the e-learning accessibility framework. It's actually at the heart of the book and of the Designing Accessible Learning Content program that I wrote. And basically, what that did for me was it allowed me to, instead of having a long list of things, it just allowed me to put it into context. So it kind of broke them down, and it followed the kind of steps that I found logical as a learning designer when I was actually going through the process of trying to make the learning content, my learning content accessible. So again, I thought after I'd spent hours and hours and hours making sense of this and doing it for myself, actually that this might be useful for a lot of other people, and that was really the impetus behind writing the book, is wanting to share that and hopefully make it easier to apply these standards than I found it when I first started getting going with accessibility. So just, I think this is the last one, just to be aware of the other kind of the myth that although we are focusing in this webinar on learning content, and that is obviously my specialization, I think the fact that accessibility only applies to websites is still an assumption or a misconception that people have, and I think it's partly maybe in the UK a little bit more because we've got those public sector bodies accessibility regulations, and they specifically refer to websites and mobile applications. So I think that that's probably reinforced the idea in a lot of organizations that when we're talking about accessibility, we're really just thinking about websites and mobile apps. So I think I think that, and the other disadvantage of that is sometimes it just reinforces the misconception. I think that accessibility is really only important for these externally facing digital content. And I think a key message really, and like which often gets lost, is that accessibility is actually vital to creating excellent digital content throughout organizations. So it covers everything. It includes learning content, social media presentations, documents, multimedia, emails, webinars, etc. And of course, those are both externally and internally facing. So accessibility is so crucial, I think, to all our digital content. And as I said, you'll find that many of the principles that we're going to explore later in the session are framed around that learning content, but they still are applicable across all the digital content that you're constantly creating. So I think that's one of the things that I've found probably most positive about my work with e-learning accessibility. I often start working with an e-learning team, and I often find that the work that we do in the e-learning team really then spreads throughout organizations. So, it may go then to the marketing, it may go to the communications team, but it's often the kind of spark. The fact that you can apply e-learning accessibility and can have such amazing transformational results by making learning content accessible, I think it gives people a great example of actually what the benefits are of making content accessible. And as I say, time and time again, I see accessibility starting with a learning team and then extending way beyond that within an organization, which is really positive. So I'm going to be moving on now to my practical accessibility. But as I said, before we do that, it's probably worth just stopping to see if there are any questions at this point. No problem if there aren't. Are you there, Rajiv?
Yes. Just sorry. We don't have any questions here. I'm just going to go
Yep,
around and see. Does
no problem.
anyone have any questions? If what I did do is I posted the how to make WCAG version 2.2 from your
Okay,
handout.
perfect.
I've posted that in the chat, and we've just had a few people saying hello. No questions as of now. Katie's
No
just said
problem.
no questions. Thank you. Graham's
Okay,
raised his hand. He's got a question. Yes, Graham.
okay. Hi,
Hi
Graham.
Susie.
Hi, Graham
So
again.
not actually a question, but just
Okay,
a comment actually on one of the very last things you said, which was about
okay.
accessibility being about much more than just websites.
Yeah,
Um, and I said in the chat, job title is Principal Officer Digital Services. It
Okay,
used to
brilliant.
be Principal Officer Web Development,
Ah,
but
interesting.
we recognised that that was narrowing the scope too much,
Yeah.
and we needed to up our game
Uh-huh.
and take on board the accessibility of anything and everything. So
Absolutely.
hence that shift to digital services to kind of make that clear to the organisation that we're about much more than just working on the council website.
Absolutely. And I think that also is a great shift to show just how important you are, I think. I think
It
it's a
does,
bit, yeah.
yes.
I think before I agree with you. I think the focus did certainly when I began was very much from an accessibility point of view, very, very focused on websites and the kind of even the when I remember when the sorry, when the public sector bodies accessibility regulations came in, I was just hoping that somewhere in the kind of legislation it would actually clearly say this applies to learning content, and it actually it never did. I think it as you say that over time people have become more aware that this covers more than that. So it's great to hear that that's actually had a really positive impact in your particular role.
Yeah, I was really disappointed when the legislation effectively says that documents delivered via a website must be accessible,
Yeah,
but documents not delivered via a website mustn't. And it straight away I looked at that and thought, is it
yeah.
just me? How
I think that's a
ridiculous.
question that we ask a lot, I think, when we start looking at the standards, isn't it? And the kind of legal speak around things. But yeah, no, I completely agree with you. There's lots of things that you think, oh, that could be a little bit clearer, or that could be phrased in a different way, which would kind of make it clear, which would help us more in our advocacy role to have that kind of in black and white in a little bit clearer. But no, great point.
Yeah, it's what leads us to say that we're about kind of legislative requirements plus,
Yeah,
because the legislative
absolutely.
requirements aren't enough.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, definitely. And that I kind of will move on to that when we talk about the sort of inclusive side of learning as well. So yeah, really interesting point.
Great, thanks. Just
Okay,
wanted to
no
point that
worries.
out.
No, really great. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. We've also had a comment from Matt. He
Yeah.
said, I was literally having a call with a team who were trying to say that accessibility wasn't a priority because they have a professional audience and grown.
Okay.
So your slide gave me a right smile. So
Yeah, still hear that. Or still hear that. And still I think that on the positive side of that is when you see the spark, when you see people get it and understand actually, oh, I need to change the way that I was thinking. This is an assumption or a misconception that I had. So that's when, you get that real, what I called it a kind of joy of accessibility. You get that real spark where you see you have changed people's way of thinking and it has made a difference. So I think that is the real positivity of what we're doing in accessibility.
yeah, and I agree with you. I think it's worth having the ability to think about who we're because like you said, we're not intentionally trying to exclude anyone or
Absolutely.
set barriers in place. It's just we may not have considered that this is a possible limitation of the system we built, whether it's an e-learning material or a software platform, whatever it
Yeah,
may be.
absolutely.
And just with having conversations with some of our apprentices, I can tell you that they've started to take this and build momentum within their organizations, and that's exciting to see. But
Definitely.
I'm glad to see that more people are having that conversation.
Fabulous. Okay, moving on then to our next section, if that's all right.
Yes,
Nothing, no
let's.
other comments. Okay, so we're going to focus, as I say, in this section on what I call practical accessibility. And just to kind of introduce this a little bit more, basically the questions that we're going to be looking at, or the topics that we're looking at, really came from a lot of the work that I did on auditing learning content. So the work that I've done, as I say, really feels like hundreds and hundreds of hours auditing learning content allowed me to kind of see patterns that were coming up. So sometimes with a particular authoring tool, there may be an issue that was repeated, but there were some very general sort of issues that came up a lot in the auditing that I did. And so what I decided to do was actually come up with an assessment, an accessibility assessment, which picked out kind of the main things that I saw occurring in the audit. So what the questions that you'll see as we go through, they're all based on the questions from this accessibility audit, which is, I call it the ELA 1000 accessibility audit. So if you wanted to have that, it's actually just in the throes of being updated. It will be probably ready in a couple of days' time. So if you did want to have a go at doing it, you have the link there, but I recommend doing it in a couple of days' time because we're just in the middle of making it better. It's that idea of progress over perfection and realizing that the questions weren't as plain and straightforward as they could be. So yeah, so if you did want to have a go at doing that, that's that you've got a code on the screen and also a link in your delegate support notes. But wait, give it a couple of days and it will be a much better experience. Anyway, so what we will see now is the idea of that assessment really is it just gives you a kind of an overview of where you're at from an accessibility point of view, and it divides the questions divided into the sections of the ELA framework that I showed you earlier. So you kind of get an overall report, an overall score, and then it divides it into those 6 different areas from the ELA framework. So it's useful, I think, if you wanted to just kind of see where you are and see where you can improve from an accessibility point of view. But the other reason for telling you that is that all of the examples that I'm showing are taken from those questions, so from that report. And as I said before, they are all based on the auditing work that I've done. So I've really picked up the issues that we see over and over again when we're doing auditing. Okay, so I'm going to start off with the first one, which comes from the resource design and tool settings. So you can see here the little icon in the corner. So that's the part of the ELA framework that we're looking at. And then the other thing that you can see is in each of these slides, in each of the questions that I've pulled out, that I've made sure that we're telling you which of those digital access needs this question is relevant to. So again, for me, that's important to make sure that we're not overlooking any one of those digital access needs. So you'll find that we'll cover all of them in the examples that I'm going through. So this first question is around color contrast. Now, I'm sure every talk you've probably heard about, someone will be probably talking about some color contrast. However, for me, it is so important to be still talking about color contrast because although this is some of the feedback that we've already got from the assessment, although about 33% of people said yes, they're absolutely sure that their color contrast is meeting the WCAG requirements. I think without a doubt, every single audit that we've done has had some issues with color contrast, and they are sometimes to do with interactive items and sometimes to do with the colors in charts and graphs. But still, we see a surprising amount of issues with text against background, and I still think that is very often because a lot of organizations are working within a brand palette, and that brand palette is really just giving them an array of colors that they can use. What people practically need is actually which of those colors they can use in contrast. That's the real issue when it comes to making sure that your color contrast is accessible. So what we recommend, and again, you've got a link to this, is a really handy tool called the 8 shapes grid, where you can put in your colors of your brand. And then you can look on this chart and it tells you which of those colors work together, which of them are meeting AA and AAA contrast. So a really, really helpful tool. And you can actually, when you've put your colors in, you can actually just ask it to show you only the AA ones, for example. So it's a really handy way of making sure at the beginning that you're meeting these requirements when you're kind of first of all doing your design and setting up your project. But some of the things that we see a lot, these are kind of typical things. So these are both an organization we work with, and they were 2 of their brand colors, and it was just the fact that these 2 colors, they weren't meeting color contrast requirements. We also have a lot of our testers are neurodivergent testers, and this particular combination of the kind of pink background with a blue font on it was really jarring for some of our neurodivergent testers. But equally for us, it was very handy that it wasn't meeting the requirements. So something that they needed to change. Another thing that we often see is organizations who might have a set of brand colors, and the actual brand colors themselves will meet, but then the organization might not have said, okay, you need to be, there are certain kind of like different weights that you can be using, or different shades of this color that you can be using. So sometimes people will use brand colors and they will change the shade, they'll make it lighter or darker. And even though the brand colors themselves may, in contrast with the text, have met the standard, sometimes those variations don't. So it's another thing that we spot quite a lot. Another thing that we see very often, well, probably not so often actually, is a problem is the text against background for buttons. So as I say, we don't see that too often, but obviously it's got huge, it's so important to get that right, that people are able to know how to navigate and to be able to clearly see your navigation buttons. A bit like on a website, if you've got a call to action button, so important that your contrast is good then, because you're wanting people to be clicking on that button. So similar in learning, it's people need to be able to understand where how to navigate. And another one that comes up quite a lot is color contrast on text against background on video. So this is an example, just you've got a lower third there where they haven't got a background to kind of light to make that clear. So it's something that we see quite a lot in video, and text in video is that it's not easy to read, and it doesn't follow, doesn't meet the color contrast. And I think that's just worth bringing that back to, again, why, we did talk about this, why it's so important. A kind of key thing from the WebAIM Million report, many of you might be aware of this. It's from the organization WebAIM, and they scan like the top million websites. And every year, without fail, the highest issue that you will see is low contrast text, and it's still phenomenal. It's actually gone up on, which isn't great, but since last year, it's actually gone up again. It's now 83.9% of the home pages of the top million websites don't have. They have low contrast text. So, it's something that we have control over and that we can change. So although it sounds a simple thing, it's so important to give people, an accessible and also a good learner experience as well. So moving on to the next one. We're looking now at text info and instructions, that particular issue. And again, this is one that we see a lot coming up in audits across different types of authoring tools, really. And it's the issue is images of text that we see. And that really is, if you're not so familiar with what that issue is about, it's really when developers use images that have text in them, such as you can see on this screen here. I think this is in the Evolve tool, but they're using a PNG example rather than adding the text directly to the page in a text box. So we see that a lot. It's a really common issue in e-learning for things like diagrams and infographics. But the issue with images of text is that it really does impact quite a lot of people, and so it has quite a lot of different implications for different access needs. So first of all, you can see an example from one of our audits where you have text at the top of the page that's added as a text box, and underneath you've got text which is added in an image. So it's probably an infographic that they've been using. Now, if I just show you what happens, that's not accessible for several different reasons. So first of all, one of the main problems is that the problem in the text and images, it often can't be read by screen readers. So you can see here the output of the NVDA speech viewer. You can see that in this case with this particular content and the way that the screen reader was set up, it just simply did not read that content that was on the page at all, the content that was in the image. So it completely missed that. The other issue is that for learners that have low vision, so vision access needs, but they might use a browser zoom or screen magnification, very often that enlarged text becomes pixelated and difficult to read, as you can see in the example here. And finally, another problem caused by using images of text is that it stops learners who have cognitive access needs from using third-party software or maybe browser plugins to customize the text. So again, you can see a good example here. Someone who's using a browser plugin is able to change the spacing in this text at the top, helps them to process, makes it easier to read for them, and that is what you can see here. However, that does not work if you have an image of text. So hopefully that's helped to explain why images of text can cause so many issues for so many different learners, and why they're definitely something to be aware of in your learning content. Doesn't matter which tool you're using. As I say, that's something that we consistently see causing problems across the board in learning content. So the next thing to think about is what happens if you do have images of text, because obviously what we're not saying with accessibility is we want it to be something that means that you strip out content and things that would be useful for learners. We don't want it to be the reason that you're not able to include things. So if you do have, and this is just an example of an image of text that you might have, then what you can do is you can actually make that accessible by providing a detailed text equivalent of the image in your learning content. So what we often do in our learning that we use is we will put it as an additional resource, or we will put it quite often in an accordion block. We'll have a detailed text description. And one thing that we found super helpful, and again, you've got this link in your delegate support notes, is actually using AI. The functionality of AI has improved so much over the last couple of months, even that if you upload a picture into AI, obviously you need to be careful about if it's your content, or if you're using a client's content, you need to be careful with how you're using AI. But for us, particularly for me, being dyslexic, I find it very, very difficult to describe complex images and charts. And so I found AI can give you very detailed descriptions of images, which I find a really useful starting point. So as with any AI, it's obviously really important to double check it and to kind of use it as a starting point and then build on from there. But it's something that I found really, really helpful in actually making it quicker for me to be putting together as alternative descriptions that are helpful for people. So both for images of text, and actually if you're just looking at alternative text in general, using AI can be really, really helpful. Okay, next one to look at is interactive items and assessment. And this comes back to the point that I was making about people that have different types of motor access needs that impact their manual dexterity. And remember, I was talking in the introduction when we were talking about that screen with the different types of access needs, about all the different types of assistive technology that people use who have manual dexterity issues. So things like adapted keyboards, mouse sticks, eye gaze technology, joysticks, touch screens, instead of a mouse or their fingers to access technology. So what we need to be aware of from our point of view, as if we're designers and developers, is to make sure that the questions that we're using or the interactivity that we're using is accessible. And the one that comes up all the time, which you're probably aware of from an e-learning point of view, is these drag and drop interactions. And in some tools, the drag and drop interactions have been made accessible, but it's really important to be aware if that's the case. The one that you can see on the screen here, when we did the audit, it wasn't accessible. I think it may have been made accessible now. So these keyboard interactions are really important to be aware of. So there's actually, if I come back to the slide before, in the 2.2 standards, there was a new standard introduced, which actually is about avoiding dragging movements or providing an alternative if you have got drag and drop movements which aren't interactive. So a couple of examples of this is, as I say, some tools make them accessible. So you can see that I think this is H5P. Their drag and drop is accessible, and then in other tools, you sometimes will have alternatives. So instead of having a drag and drop, you might have a matching drop or a sequence drop, which kind of is instead of the drag and drops. The other thing you can do, and this is an example that I've probably been talking about maybe 8 years now. I can't remember, but it's an example of how I got around a problem with the authoring tool, which was a storyline tool that I was using, and the drag and drop wasn't accessible. But I really wanted there to be a kind of equivalent drag and drop because I was trying to make this idea that we were making we were trying to get the students where I was working to kind of put things in the recycling. So I just used a multiple option question, but I combined it with animation paths to make a similar experience, really, to convey the important learning point. So it was that idea that sometimes accessibility just makes you think differently, and it can really lead to innovation and not limitation. So on the screen now, if your authoring tool doesn't tell you if its interaction is accessible, you can do your own testing of keyboard accessibility. So on the screen, you can see some kind of very basic keyboard navigation. And again, that's I think there's links in your delegate support notes if you want to have a go and put your mouse away and have a go at using keyboard navigation. It's one of the most, for me, it was a kind of one of the most kind of light bulb moments of working out how to use keyboard navigation. It's a great skill to have and to test. Okay, so moving now on to audio and video content, without a doubt features probably most often in the audits that we do. So I've actually decided to focus on two issues in this category. The first one is captions and the second is audio description or descriptive transcripts. So the first one is captions, and that obviously directly impacts learners that have hearing access needs, and they need captions to provide an equivalent learning experience for video content. And that is what is a real key thing, is to be thinking when I'm doing auditing and when I'm creating my own learning content, is to be thinking as close as possible to have an equivalent learning experience. So one of the things that we see in auditing, which still surprises me, is sometimes we will audit content that doesn't have any captions at all. And that obviously means that someone who is hard of hearing or who is deaf is not able to have an equivalent experience. So, but even if organizations do provide captions, I still think there are some common issues which people often overlook. So coming a bit maybe more back to those kind of barriers that we might not have considered. So again, coming back to this idea of providing an equivalent learning experience and also meeting those guidelines, it's just worth a reminder that captions they need to be synchronized to the action. So just providing a transcript isn't enough. They also need to be descriptive, which means they contain things like important sound effects, who's speaking, and emotions conveyed by a tone of voice, which someone who's deaf or hard of hearing may miss. And they also need to be accurate. So that means they need to contain punctuation and be error free. Now, that's also when you're thinking about auto-generated captions, sometimes you might be using videos where you don't have the control over the captions, but unfortunately, sometimes those auto-generated captions, very often they don't have punctuation and they can also have a lot of errors. So really the key message for those captions is to make sure they're available for all the videos and also make sure that they're synchronized, descriptive and accurate if you can. So let's move on now to our next video issue. And that is videos that have visual content. So the one that we were looking at before, we were thinking about people who had hearing access needs. If you look at the little icon here, you can see we're thinking about vision access needs. So we're thinking about learners who have videos, that have visual content, but they might not have audio description or a descriptive transcript. And that means that someone who's blind or has low vision would miss really important content. And again, they wouldn't be having an equivalent learning experience. So again, coming back to the data that we'd collected already from our assessment, we found that actually this was probably the question that most people were not aware of. They either didn't have audio description or descriptive transcripts, or they weren't sure if they did have. It was the highest percentage, and quite a high percentage of respondents weren't sure about this. So what I'm going to do now is just show you a really memorable example of a video that we actually found in an audit, and I promise you that once you've seen it, you'll never be able to miss this need for audio description or descriptive transcripts again. It's a really uh, impactful example, I think, that, as I say, we actually had in an audit. So I'm going to play it for you in a minute. And what I'd like you to do to start is just watch it with your eyes open. And then just imagine what this experience would be like for someone who had very low vision or who was blind. So just before I start the video, just to let you know, it does have background music, just in case I don't want to startle anyone when I start playing the video. So I'm going to play it. And again, what I want you to do is just watch it with your eyes open and then imagine what the experience would be like for someone who had low vision or was blind. So I'll stop now. I won't take you through the whole video, even though it is very impactful. So great. I'd like you to have a think about that experience the next time you add any videos to your learning, and just be reminded of the feedback that came from our blind screen reader tester, Kirsty Wolf. So in her report, it still makes me smile. Her report on this video that she watched, she said, "I enjoyed the classical music in the video, but I have no idea what I'm supposed to take from it in terms of learning content." So if you imagine what Kirsty missed from not having access to that content, that really is for me, a great reminder of what we need to be thinking of when we're adding, to be really, really clear about the visual content in video and making sure that everybody can have an equivalent experience. So one of the issues that we find a lot, so obviously that was quite an extreme example. One of the things that we see quite a lot in our audits that we pick up on is just look on the lookout for things like on-screen text that's often missed out of the narration. And that's, as I say, a really common issue that there might be narration there, but for some reason, on-screen text will pop up. Sometimes it will be, in this case, some important content. Sometimes it will be an introduction of the speaker and their role, for example. But it's really common that we see that missed out of video content. So, a real important thing to be aware of. Now, obviously, if you do have a video that has important visual content, if you can add audio description, or you can have the narrator actually narrate or explain what's happening in the video. The other thing that you can do is to add a descriptive a descriptive transcript. And as you can see here, very common. This is taken from our Designing Accessible Learning Content program, which is created using RISE. You can see that we have here in this accordion block, which is open. That's how we will do our descriptive transcripts. And as you can see, that has the visual explaining what's happening as well as the narration as well. So that's a good way of making sure that you make all of your content, everyone has equivalent access to that content. Okay, moving on to our next issue, which impacts moving content. So coming back to who we're covering here. Remember, we were talking about people that have conditions that are impacted by things like vestibular disorders, so they're impacted by moving content. Also, people with cognitive access needs from the point of view of being neurodivergent can be very impacted by moving content. For me, as someone who's dyslexic, my particular dyslexia, I find it really, really difficult to process content if there's moving content on the screen. So that might resonate with some of you as well. That's my one particular thing that absolutely floors me. So the things that we see in learning content in our audits are often things like see this example here of decorative images in the background. So if your learner isn't able to stop or pause that or hide it, then that can be really difficult for them to be processing. For me, that it would be practically impossible for me to actually process the points on that screen, that the bullet points on that particular screen. Other things that we see are things like markers that move, and this is an example, again, based on an audit of a marker that had animation that you couldn't control. And even when you open the hotspots there, the animation just didn't stop. So that's again can be very difficult for people to with these kind of sensitivity to movement, to concentrate and focus on. So really important that you, if you do use things like any kind of animation or moving content, that you allow learners control so that they can pause or stop or hide it. Okay, moving on to the last one now, which is around mobile code and strategy. So I think this is really important, and we're focusing a bit more on the underlying code, which is absolutely essential for learners often of assistive technology to have a good learner experience. So by far the most common issue we find with regard to coding is around heading levels. So heading levels are really essential for assistive technology users, including screen reader users, and they need good coding to help them understand the content and the structures of the pages and also to navigate. So if they're coded correctly, they can identify heading levels, including heading level 1, which should be the main title of the page. Now, screen reader users will often use shortcut keys such as H1 to jump directly to the main heading of the page just to anchor themselves, especially if they get lost or the page structure is confusing. So sometimes you'll have authoring tools that apply the coding by default. So you can see with this example from Rise that that's automatically assigned heading levels 1 and heading level 2 on the headings of this page. I haven't done anything to that. It does it automatically. In some tools, like this is an example from Storyline, developers need to manually apply heading styles, as you can see here. But if the developer doesn't know about accessibility or doesn't know how to use the tool to make accessible learning content, it's very common that this isn't done. And what you can see here, again, this NVDA speech reviewer will not identify this as a heading level if the person hasn't gone in and manually applied that. The other issue, which we often see, is non-hierarchical headings. So when skipped heading levels, that's probably the one thing that we see most often. And that type of thing really leaves screen readers confused. And Kirsty, our screen reader tester, will often say it makes her anxious because she's worried that she's missing information. So you can see this example again from an earlier example, I think, of the Adapt authoring tool, that they have a heading level 1, but they haven't got, and a heading level 3, but they haven't got a heading level 2. So obviously someone who's using assistive technology and isn't able to see that will be thinking, well, you know, where's my heading level 2? What have I missed there? So it can cause a lot of confusion and make it very difficult to process content. So just a reminder then that they're really crucial really for helping learners using assistive technology, coming back to this idea of perceiving, understanding, navigating, and also interacting with learning experiences. So I hope you found those examples useful, and they've given you some ideas of things that of identifying and removing some of the accessibility barriers in your own content. So we'll move on in a second, just checking the time. I think we're still okay. Moving on to accessible and inclusive learning. So any comments or questions, Rajiv, that I need to be aware of?
There aren't any comments or questions. I've just been following your lead and posting links as you
Okay,
go.
perfect. Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so what we'll do now is just move on then to what we call practical inclusivity and learner experience. So what we did before, so before we kind of look at these examples in more details, I just think it warrants a bit more of an explanation and even a kind of exploration into the definition of what I call inclusive learning and the difference between inclusive learning and accessible learning. So just to explain, for a long time when I was talking about accessible learning, I used to talk about accessible and inclusive learning and almost use them interchangeably. And I wasn't really sure on what I was meaning about the difference between accessible learning and inclusive learning. And like often happens, you have one of those kind of like light bulb moments where it suddenly all makes sense. So in my case, it was when we were doing auditing. And I was realizing that there was a lot of things that I could identify as being violations of the standards. So they weren't meeting the web content accessibility guidelines. But there was a whole range of things that were either because normally for the audits we're looking at level A and double A criteria. So there were either kind of triple A criteria, which didn't fit in. It wasn't a violation because we weren't testing to triple A, which actually meant that there was something that kind of undermined the learning experience for people, or it was other things which very often from a cognitive point of view, because some of the web content accessibility guidelines, it's well known that they don't cover so much, although there's different work going on to address that, but the standards themselves are sometimes rightly criticized for not focusing so much on cognitive access needs. So I kind of realized, oh, I needed another section which isn't just standard violations. And it was, what do I call that? And I suddenly thought, well, actually that is making it kind of a bit more user friendly, or a better learner experience, or more inclusive for everyone. And then I had another a light bulb moment, which was a friend of mine, Essie Hardy, who runs an organization called Celebrating Disability. And she put together this incredible video. And it was all based around a wheelchair user who went to visit a restaurant with a group of friends. And the group of friends were introduced they were welcomed by the manager through the front door, sat at the table. The wheelchair user needed to go through to the accessible entrance, which, as you can see from the image on the screen, was through the kitchen. Before that, she'd had to go down a dark alleyway past the bins, then through the kitchen, then past the toilets, and then she got to the table. And it really made me think that just the message that she put on the bottom of that experience was, just because it's accessible, it doesn't necessarily mean it's inclusive. And it had a really powerful impact on me. And it really made me rethink those two terms specifically when it came to learning content. So what we say, the kind of definition that I came up with really. So when we're talking about accessible learning content, we focus more on whether it's meeting the standards. And in our case, generally, that's the WCAG standards, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. But when we talk about inclusive learning content, it goes beyond those technical standards. And what it means instead is learning that makes all learners feel welcomed, considered, and valued, and it provides a good learner experience for everyone. So, of course, in its widest sense, that means considering every lens of diversity, equity, inclusion. But just for the purposes of this session, we're going to focus on people just with disabilities and access needs. So, as well as helping me to clarify my own thinking around the difference between accessible and inclusive learning content, those two definitions were really important in that approach to auditing that I was talking about before, because it really allowed us to say, okay, these are things that are a violation of the standards. But actually these are things that would make people feel welcomed and included, and that they would provide a good learner experience. So just to clarify what I mean, I'm just going to give you some examples of things that we often identify in this kind of section that we call learner experience and inclusive learning. So one of the things that we often focus on is inclusive timing information. So very often we might see an example where someone has given their learners an indication of how long the learning is going to take, and that can be really helpful. That's if it's an absolute time, as I say, it gives you an indication. But we also found, again, feedback from our neurodivergent learners that actually can cause people stress and make them think, immediately start worrying that they might need to take longer than that, for example. So what we would advocate as a more inclusive approach to timing is making sure that learners know, maybe giving them a range. This is some examples from our designing accessible learning content. So giving people a range of how long it can take, but also being really clear if people can take breaks and if they can come back to the learning and whether it will have held their progress. So very often we see learning content that doesn't give people that upfront information, which can really make a difference to how, if people are feeling relaxed before they begin the learning. So, and that's something that everyone benefits from, not just people with disabilities and access needs. Another one is inclusive language. So coming back to the motor access needs and all the different ways that people interact with content, this idea really of is something that we do in our learning, and we recommend for people. It's not a violation of any rules, but this idea of maybe avoiding using click because it is, assuming that everybody is using content. Obviously, people will understand what we mean if we say click, but just being more inclusive is this idea of maybe using select instead of using click to kind of include everybody and realize that not everybody is accessing content in the same way. And other things like again, because we're doing auditing, we're really focusing on the language, so we just pick things up. So maybe using words like hit might again be not include everybody. It's a bit like clicked, or here was verbs that might exclude people. So again, not technically a violation saying we'll walk through the process, but maybe not making everyone feel necessarily welcomed and considered. So maybe using, work or go as potential alternatives. So just having a bit more of an open mind, really. So inclusive imagery, this is something that we see very often. We see stock images of people with disabilities used, but it's often the same type of disability. So often stock imagery of somebody in a wheelchair. And one of the things that you probably, noticed in the presentation and in all of our learning that we provide is to make sure that we have images with a whole broad range of disabilities and access needs. And it comes back to this great uh, phrase that I'm not sure where I heard it once, but this idea of representation fueling change. So by using these, different images of people with different types of disability, sometimes we're just challenging people's assumptions and really fueling this change, through our learning content. Consistency is so important, particularly for neurodivergent learners. It's obviously good design, and but we sometimes see examples where I think people think, well, I don't want to be saying this in the same way because people might find that it's boring. So they might, quite often we will have examples of asking the same task or the same behavior or informing the same thing, but doing it in a different way. Now, for us and for our neurodivergent test, it's much better to be consistent. So otherwise, if you're changing the way that you're giving instructions, what you can do is really be increasing cognitive load unnecessarily. So keeping things just plain and straightforward is really beneficial. And sometimes it's worth double checking your instructions, because sometimes we just see instructions that don't, maybe I think often because you might have a different iteration of the learning and you might not have gone back and checked it. So just making sure that that they are accurate. So for this one, it's saying select the icons below when they're actually not below, they're to the side. And also sometimes they just don't make sense at all. So I think again, this is probably an example was from an audit, but maybe it was the instruction might have been left from a different interaction that maybe changed in one of the iterations. So always go back and just make sure that your instructions, so important that your instructions are clear and easy to follow. And finally, we'll just focus on plain language, because I think that's a great one to come back to. So this was again a saying that, or an expression that I had was when I was working in the university sector, and it really resonated with me. The more educated the person and the more specialist their knowledge, the greater their preference for plain language. So again, it's that assumption that we make that sometimes we don't want to make things more straightforward because we feel that we should be having a sort of a particular level of language because of the audience. And I think that for me was a really useful reminder that actually plain language is important for everybody. So a couple of things that I use that we use as well in our when we're creating learning content. So if you have control over if you're writing the learning content, so sometimes you have subject matter experts, but if you're writing the learning content yourself, lots of readability checkers that you can use. A lot of them are inbuilt in the tools that we're using. One that's a standalone one that we use quite a lot of recommend is the Hemingway app. And that the reason I quite like this one is because it clearly gives you a kind of a sort of like what's hard to read or very hard to read. So if I'm writing something and it comes up pink, then I know that. And again, I'm not colorblind, so this isn't an issue for me. But I know that I need to go in and do a lot of work on that to make it more readable. If you're working with subject matter experts and you're being given the text, another one that I find quite handy is the WebFX one, which gives you traffic light indicators. And that's really helpful, I think, because it can be a bit more persuasive if you're working with your subject matter expert to try and maybe simplify the language. Rather, if you show them that lots of readability checkers are assessing it to be quite tricky to read, it's a bit more persuasive, I think, than if you just say I think it's too difficult and we need to change it. So again, another thing that I find quite useful with AI. Again, when it was this has come a long way since I started using it, but just asking AI maybe to give different if I put in a sentence or a paragraph and I want to simplify it, just to ask it to do it at different reading levels, and then take kind of like bits of it, maybe like a little phrase or a word that I find it makes it simplifies it for me. I find that, and again, because of my dyslexia, I find it really difficult sometimes to be thinking of it's simplifying that I find most difficult. So it can be really helpful just to get a prompt from AI and think, okay, I can say that in a slightly different way. So that is the end of the kind of inclusive examples. Again, if there are any questions or comments.
Again, it looks like we have no questions or comments, but I'm
Okay,
going to just ask sorry. I'm
no
just going
worries.
to ask if anyone does have any questions. Either you can raise your hand, unmute yourselves and ask the question, or you can post it in the chat. Do not see any questions here just yet. No, nothing's come
Okay,
through just yet. We'll
no problem.
circle back towards the end of the session, of course.
Okay, no worries. So yeah, I've just literally got just a couple of slides to finish with. So just some key takeaways really. So hopefully you found those practical examples useful. I think particularly for me, the inclusivity ones, it's just worth bearing in mind that they for me when I'm auditing and when I'm doing my own learning content, it's that kind of the cognitive side of things and the sort of making sure that our content is accessible for learners with cognitive access needs and sometimes neurodivergent conditions as well, that really make it's that kind of overlap between universal design for learning and just very good instructional design. And I think yeah, I think that for me is the kind of next slide that I have here is coming back to this, the awards. And the reason that I'm showing you this slide again is just one of the most important things that I think about, the key takeaways is this kind of quote that I have here. The most significant hidden risk of not engaging with e-learning accessibility is that you're missing a golden opportunity to dramatically improve the practice of your learning practitioners, the effectiveness of your learning content, and the learning experience of all your learners. So I think the moving away from thinking of accessibility as being something that limits us, something that undermines the learning, to actually it being fundamental to really excellent learning design. And again, that was the strategy of why we wanted to prove that accessible learning content really could be, excellent enough to be winning major awards in our industry. That it was something that we really felt important to be able to prove. So the other one of the key takeaways is this idea of progress over perfection. So if you think back to the web content accessibility guidelines that we're trying to meet, when you think back to the kind of inclusivity as well, obviously there is a lot to take on board and a lot to kind of implement when you're trying to make your learning content accessible, and it can sometimes feel very overwhelming. So this idea of progress over perfection is a mantra that's very common in accessibility, but I think it's so important because the fact that sometimes accessibility can sometimes feel overwhelming. There is a tendency sometimes within organizations and also practitioners to maybe feel overwhelmed and to kind of think this is too complicated, or I'm not good enough, or I don't know enough and this is too difficult. So the really important thing is the message behind progress over perfection is not to give up, because you really are making a huge impact on people if you do make your learning content content inclusive consider is maybe an accessibility statement, which are very common for websites. You see them quite a lot now, especially because of the public sector bodies' accessibility regulations. But considering having an accessibility statement in if you're learning content, either at course level or on your LMS, can be something that allows you to kind of accept that there are some limitations, that you're not going to make it as accessible for everyone as you want to, but that you can show someone these are the issues that we know that we have, that we're working towards fixing. Sometimes you're not able to do anything about them because of your tool constraints or organizational constraints. So for me, the idea of having an accessibility statement is a really important thing to consider and can be really beneficial for this idea of knowing that, like the quote that we have here, being honest about inaccessibility is a form of accessibility in itself. That was from David Henke Reed from AbilityNet, and it had a real impact on me, because I thought, yes, that's really what an accessibility statement does. It shows that we're committed to this, we're doing our best, but it's not possible sometimes to get it as perfect as we would like it to be. And just putting in a contact that people can get hold of you if you are having those type of issues, I think is, if they are having an accessibility issues that you've either you haven't anticipated or that you weren't aware of, can be really, really helpful to kind of moving forward and not being stuck. And I'm just going to skip over that one because I think just move on back to the accessibility assessment. So as I say, if you wanted to have a go at doing that one, there is a link in your support guide. So that's a good place to start if you are starting from scratch with accessibility and want to see where you are in your learning content. And then just finally, some contact details. So if anyone has any questions or wants to continue the discussion, I'm really happy for you to email me or to contact me on LinkedIn.
Okay, brilliant. I've just put the contact information and the accessibility assessment,
Fabulous.
the link to it in the chat. So everyone who would like to get in touch, please do. We've got a few comments coming in now saying thank you. Kirsty says, really insightful. Thank you very much. Katie says, very insightful. Thank you. Not sure if they copied off of each other, but that looks exactly the same. Matt's also said, very interesting talk. Thank you very much. Thank you, Susie. And Charlotte says, thank you, Susie. I was really useful and informative. I have your book that I'm currently reading, which is brilliant. Thank you for the session.
Thank you. That's very kind.
Elizabeth just said, thank you. That was a very interesting presentation.
Oh, lovely. Thank you.
And I agree. So this is again a slightly different perspective from what we used to, because we talk about accessibility all the time at Purple Beard because we've got a number of apprentices on the program. But looking at it from, are we considering it for not just e-learning, but all kind of learning material that we're producing? Yeah, and that's something that I think is going to be quite useful going forward, because we do talk about making documents accessible, making media accessible, but tying it all together in an e-learning format probably is the best way to go about it. Brilliant.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, now before I let everyone go back about their day, because I know we've had a little over an hour that we've spent on this conversation, but if anyone has any questions, comments, or just wants to bring a problem statement to the table and see if we've got a solution for you, between myself and Susie, if we've got a solution for you, we'd be happy to answer any questions. Does anyone want to unmute yourselves and turn your cameras, just say hello, ask any questions, or are we all okay today? We're good to go. No, it's a bit okay. Rena has also said very interesting session. Thank you. Okay, good. I'm just going to scroll back up. Yes, Liz did ask a question a little earlier. Just realized I missed that. So the question was, do you ever find that recommendations for accessibility are at odds with recommendations for inclusivity? I don't have any examples, but just wondered whether these two always sit hand in hand or whether there is sometimes some compromise.
That's a really, really good question. I generally see it as complementing rather than being in conflict with each other. I mean, I think probably one of the issues that comes up quite a lot is people are concerned that if they do something that makes something accessible and inclusive for someone with one type of condition, may not necessarily benefit someone with a different type of condition. So one of the things that springs to mind if we're talking about learning content, when we're not necessarily just talking about e-learning, but we're talking about webinars, for example, um, is when you have automatic captions for live content. And so if learners aren't able to control if they can switch the live captions on or off, you can sometimes get the fact that people are they can find the movement of those captions if they're kind of like automatically on and they can't control them. Someone with who was neurodivergent who may be impacted by moving content. So a lot of neurodivergent people will use captions and will find them helpful, but you might find that someone, might not want that. They might want to not want to they might find that distracting, for example. So I suppose in an ideal world is giving people control. That is a fundamental kind of principle of accessibility is allowing people different ways to access the content and giving people control. So that I suppose is an example where your the inclusivity could be kind of undermining, it might not be suiting everybody. So as I say, that for me is in those types of situations, that's where I think the kind of overwhelm can come from, because you really you're trying to do your very best for everybody, but you may be doing something that might not suit someone. So if someone can contact you and let you know that that's an issue, for me, that's the great idea of having your contact details in an accessibility statement or in any information about that. And if it comes to choosing which is which, if there is anything that actually stops someone accessing the content, then that would probably take precedent over the fact that someone else didn't find that as an inclusive experience, if you see what I mean. So hopefully that's kind of answered that, sort of.
Thank you. That's really helpful.